As for Russia's participation in the G8 and the ongoing contacts with President Putin, Salvini made a thoughtful reflection on the current state of Italy's diplomatic relations with Russia, just as Macron did, for example, regarding relations with Europe, in the sense that, and on this point, beyond what Italy's relations are, because we are in a context, which is also, in short, that of the continued cooperation within the European Union. However, I personally think that Macron is right about this. That is, I firmly believe the time has come for Europe as well to talk with Russia. Because if Europe decides to take part in this phase of negotiations by speaking only with one of the two sides involved, I'm afraid that in the end, the positive contribution it can make will be significantly limited overall in practice.
Thank you, Jacopo Matano, TG3 Rai. Good morning, Mr. President.
Good morning to you.
Listen, I'm going back to Ukraine a bit, also regarding internal reflections. For the first time, let's say, representatives, including prominent members of the League, have made it known that they hope the decree with which Italy annually supports Ukraine will not receive Parliament's approval. Regardless of how this will turn out, then there will have to be a vote, evidently, perhaps even on Article 5. Regardless of how this vote and these votes go, I want to sincerely ask you, don't these positions risk weakening or even worse, influencing your important work at the international negotiating tables? And if I may, Salvini said he hopes that Italy will be the first country to build and rebuild bridges with Russia. I'd just like to ask if you agree with that, and also if you agree that Russia should now return to the G8. I'm listening, please.
To all the various opinions that are currently being expressed, even within the majority, I too have read about someone who was hoping that the Ukraine aid decree would not get the necessary votes to pass. Personally, I don't think that's how it will go. And as I've already said before, I would consider that to be a significant mistake. I'm especially surprised that this particular sentiment comes from a general, precisely because of what I was saying earlier about the importance of deterrence in this context. Soldiers are the first to understand how truly fundamental and absolutely essential the armed forces are for building and maintaining peace, and not just, let's say, for waging war. As for Russia's participation in the G8 and the ongoing contacts with President Putin, Salvini made a thoughtful reflection on the current state of Italy's diplomatic relations with Russia, just as Macron did, for example, regarding relations with Europe, in the sense that, and on this point, beyond what Italy's relations are, because we are in a context, which is also, in short, that of the continued cooperation within the European Union. However, I personally think that Macron is right about this. That is, I firmly believe the time has come for Europe as well to talk with Russia. Because if Europe decides to take part in this phase of negotiations by speaking only with one of the two sides involved, I'm afraid that in the end, the positive contribution it can make will be significantly limited overall in practice. After that, though, where is the problem with this? The problem with this is who should do it. Because if we were to make the mistake of deciding on the one hand to reopen dialogue with Russia and on the other hand to proceed each on our own, by doing so, we would be doing Putin a favor. And the last thing I want to do in life is a favor for Putin. We've had this problem since the beginning of the negotiations. There are many voices speaking and many formats that exist. That's why I've always been strongly in favor of appointing a dedicated special envoy from Europe on the Ukrainian issue. In other words, someone who would allow us to bring everything together, coordinate our efforts, but also speak with a single unified voice. And this, in fact, is the real issue that puts us in difficulty. After that, the relations with Italy, Russia in the G7, and what will happen in the future. We'll talk about this when we have a peace process. That is, when we have peace. But I'll go further. We'll also discuss it based on the conditions under which peace is achieved. So for now, it seems absolutely premature to me. Today, Russia's entry would seem impossible. Let's say Russia's entry in the G7, for example. But these are all topics that will be addressed when and if there is peace. And I repeat, also depending on how it is achieved, under what conditions it is achieved.
Thank you. Barbara Acquavidi, Aska News.
Good morning, President. I would also like to bring you back to a topic of national politics. 2026 could be the year when the process of reforming the electoral law begins. You have already clearly made it clear that there will be no government initiative or proposal on this issue, and that the debate will be left to the parliamentary chambers. However, what I would like to ask you also as the head of the main party in the majority is whether you have already personally discussed this with any of the opposition leaders. For what reason? Do you believe, for example, that Lichtlein should be interested in collaborating on the reform of an electoral law in a proportional sense with a majority bonus like the one currently being discussed? And if there were no agreement, even with part of the opposition, would you still be ready to vote for this reform with only the majority's votes? Thank you.
There are discussions with the opposition, even if not necessarily at my level. You know that Parliament is handling this, so the mandate is also, it is Parliament that is responsible for engaging in dialogue with the opposition. The reason why I think that Eli Schlein, but not only her, Eli Schlein should look favorably on a reform in the sense you mentioned, as it aligns with the principles and objectives that have been discussed. Furthermore, it is important to emphasize that this is indeed a reform that allows whoever gets the most votes to govern for 5 years with a solid majority. It's an advantage for everyone. And in fact, from my point of view, it could perhaps represent an even greater advantage for the opposition than for the majority. In other words, the game would be wide open with a reform like this. The game would be more than open, and paradoxically, it could give the opposing side an even larger majority in the event of victory than they would get with the current electoral law. So the issue is not just about winning, but also about whether or not you are truly able to govern once you win. So for me, the important thing is that citizens have real power, meaning that citizens actually go to vote, and then the day after, whoever got even just one more vote can govern based on the will of the people, and there are no choices made by the citizens that are then broken apart and reassembled inside the halls of power. Because this is also what causes, or rather above all, this is what causes people to lose interest in voting. This is what leads to abstention. This is what creates all the problems we know about. So we can talk about it later. Let's say it's not up to me and I don't intend to do it. Besides, let's say I'm not an expert on the subject. We can talk about the details, and we can also talk about many different things if it were up to me. But that is also the suggestion I allowed myself to give. Let us say this to Brothers of Italy, which I share, let us say, with the other members of the majority. Clearly for us, the main goal is to try to achieve, let us say, as much unity as possible. Broad, I repeat, on something that should matter to everyone. Because the point is not just to make a law that guarantees, obviously, not only respect for the popular vote, but also to make a law that ensures stability for whoever wins the election. This isn't just my problem. In fact, it could actually be, let's say, a much bigger and more significant matter of concern for the opposition. So I believe that everyone should genuinely have an interest in passing a law like this, and I sincerely hope there can be a positive dialogue from this point of view, that there won't be any prejudicial closures. Also, to address the rest of your question, that is, if there is a debate and an opportunity to start a discussion, we will very clearly do everything we can to ensure that the rules are shared. If there is a prejudicial closure, I don't rule out that it may still be necessary. Let's say to ask Parliament by majority to resolve this issue in order to ensure that citizens have the certainty that what is decided in the elections is actually carried out.